Hello, everyone. This is Coach Matt with the Seattle Chess School. In this particular video, we're actually going to show some Budapest Gambit Fajarowicz games. So we'll get to basically see this particular gambit in action. If you guys haven't seen the video, it's called Making a Case for the Fajarowicz Budapest, which of course is d4, knight f6, c4, e5, gambiting the pawn. Pawn takes pawn, and instead of the classic knight g4, we play the Fajarowicz variation, knight e4. So watching that particular video will show the different strategies we were talking about in each of the lines. In this particular video, we're actually going to see games. All these games, I will be playing the black pieces. I will not mention who the opponent is, just merely their rating. All of these games were correspondence games. So they were at least 1 day per move, all the way up to 5 days per move. So extremely slow, a slow form of chess, but they make for better evidence, I suppose, because if you try out something in bullet chess, and of course you can win games on time, which is perfectly fine, but it doesn't really prove the efficiency or the goodness of a certain variation. So these particular games, both sides had many hours and many days to make each move. So they show, some of the strategies that we can use here. Okay, so what we will do is we will go through a game per variation. So all the variations that were shown in the first video, queen c2, queen d4, queen d5, knight to d2, knight f3, and a3. We will show a game with each of these variations. So the first game that we will start off with is queen to d5. Okay, so this particular opponent was rated 2150. Queen d5 is a rather provocative move, especially after white's next. So as I mentioned in the making a case for video, any queen move in this position will be met by bishop to b4 check, which of course helps with castling. It also helps with development. Now, most players, I would say, would guard this check with bishop to d2 and and try to exchange off a couple of pieces. This particular opponent played knight to d2. So this means that there is unpleasant pressure here on the e4 knight, and there isn't really too many places to move to. Normally with knight to d2, we would be playing knight to c5, but here this looks a little bit unplayable, especially with a3. So what we must do is protect the knight, and we did so with f5. So here white has a chance to en passant or try to keep the queen on d5 and at least try to block out castling. This opponent actually took en passant, and here we must take back with the knight, which does give white some queen moves, including queen e5 check if they want to try this. This player played queen to d3, retreating, which allows black to castle. Now, after a few normal looking moves by both sides, knight f3, d6, a3, which puts the question to the bishop, and rather than try to keep it and try to put it on bishop c5 and try to create some pressure, here we just simply exchanged off, take with the bishop, knight to d7. In most cases, the knight does go to c6, but here the c5 square looks kind of nice. Also, possibly going to e5 will be nice. Also, this bishop is intending to go to b7, where it won't be blocked by a knight on c6. So e3, b6, bishop e2, bishop b7, castle, and queen to e8. So black is very close to completing development. And this is one of the typical type of positions that you can get from the Fajarowicz, where you are down a pawn but have extremely good development, which is very similar to other gambits. For example, the Marshall Gambit and the Ruy Lopez. Black has something similar where they sacrifice a pawn but get excellent development. Some King's Gambit variations are like this. The wing gambit in the Sicilian defense is like this, where one side is going to be permanently down a pawn, but will have great squares for the rest of their pieces. So the question is, can we do something with our big pieces, or can we get our pawn back, essentially? So let's see what happened here. So bishop to c3, good move, putting the bishop on a nice diagonal. White, incidentally, also has the bishop pair plus a pawn, which I would venture to guess that most players would enjoy those two small advantages. Okay, so knight to c5 improves the knight slightly, hits the queen retreats, and then the F knight goes into e4. Now this, of course, is attacking the bishop. Also, we're making room for queen to g6 with, a certain amount of pressure upon the white king side. So rook to c1. So already, if black wants to, we could get the bishop pair back just by simply capturing the bishop. Instead, queen g6 was played, just simply putting the queen on a good spot. Nothing concrete yet. b4, forcing the knight to do something. This is a concrete move, of course, by white. Knight to e6. So this is the usual square for the knight in most of these variations where the knight is on c5 and white ever kicks it with b4. e6 is the most normal post. Okay, so in this position, white decides to save the bishop pair and then rook to f7. So this is a good building style move. In fact, in most cases, the best place to put rooks are on the 7th rank. However, if you could put rooks on the 2nd rank, this not only prevents invasion on said rank, it also guards every pawn that hasn't moved. It also gives excellent chances to double, not just on the F file, but on any file that is useful. We could double on the E, we could try to double on the D if we need to. So not only is the rook f7 a good defensive move, but it's essentially preparing rook f8 with total coordination of the pieces. Although we still don't have anything concrete yet. We don't have any clear targets. We don't have any clear threats that we can make, but we certainly have some good looking pieces here. All right, so knight to e1. Now, this is where the game changed. In my opinion, knight e1 is a clear mistake. Quite possibly, the idea of it was to push the pawn to f3 and start to kick away the Fajarowicz knight and also try to block up the bishop as well as the rook. So it was, nicely motivated, but not nicely executed. Here, knight 6g5 is already a scary looking move, especially when knight h3 is a big giant threat. The viewers that are paying attention here might notice that bishop to e2 does skewer stuff. However, knight to h3 is simply a killing move because it's check. This pawn can't take. When the king moves to the side, knight takes f2 a couple of times is going to win some heavy duty material there. So bishop to h5 really isn't on. In this position, queen c2 was tried. So white is, finally looking like they got a fairly decent setup here with the bishop pair and the extra pawn. Unfortunately for white, knight h3 is just simply a winning move. After the king moves to h1, which is the only move, black collapses on f2 with check. Capturing is compulsory. Knight takes f2 is check. King to g1. Knight goes back to h3, forcing the king into the corner. And now, instead of trading queens, we just simply play bishop to e4 to prevent the queen trade. And when white played bishop to d3 to try to enforce some sort of trades, the final piece was invited to the party. And since rook f1 is extraordinarily difficult to stop, white resigned. So this features a fairly good attack with this particular gambit. All right, line number 2 is pawn takes pawn, knight to e4, and queen to d4. Okay, so this was the original move that I believe Grandmaster Tartakover recommended. Against this, we will still play bishop to b4 check. And depending on how they block will depend on how we play. So this particular opponent played knight c3. This opponent was rated 1850. And knight c3 again puts unpleasant pressure on to the knight. So this means that we have to do something decisive in this position. Last time we defended this with the F pawn. However, here, because there will be some pawn weaknesses on C3, we can simply capture this guy. So pawn takes knight is only move. And here the bishop must, well, does not have to move back yet. We could play knight C6, developing a piece for free, which is one of the drawbacks, in my opinion, to the queen D4 line. Black will eventually get knight C6 for free and then can develop their pieces, normally. All right, so here the bishop is under attack, and it turns out that keeping the pressure onto the C3 pawn is extremely useful, even if white can play bishop to A3, which will block out castling. The pressure on C3 and also the pressure on E5 sort of blocks out the pressure that bishop A3 would provide. So in this position, white played F4. Now, I didn't actually go over this particular move in the making a case for video. This does look like the greediest way for white to play, because, of course, the E5 pawn is guarded with the weakest chess man. Knight F3 does the same thing, but then we can still keep piling up on the E pawn. Here with the F pawn guarding, white is really intending to hold on to the pawn forever. Now, the only troubling part with F4, though, is that it does weaken the king side quite a bit, specifically F2 and E3. Also, the dark square bishop isn't going to have a wonderful future if this pawn is sitting here on F4. So we could just meet this by just simply castling, continuing with development, and after knight to F3, another logical looking move, we played F6. So this is one of the whole points to the gambit, where we actually have pawn breaks in the form of D6 and F6. And when these moves are played, they will increase the power of black's back row pieces, specifically the rooks and the bishops. So, for example, when white captures here, black captures back with the queen, and suddenly this rook is quite good on the F file. Also, because the E file is now half open, this rook now has a future place once the light square bishop is developed. So again, we're having a gambit position type of thing where we're giving up a pawn, but our point is to have some sort of compensation in the form of superior development, quicker king castling. In this particular position, we have all kinds of pawns that we can pick on later. We have all kinds of empty squares that can be picked on. Lots of places are weak and can be attacked. So, for a pawn sacrifice, that seems like quite a lot of compensation. So let's see how this proceeded. Queen at E5 is check, and luckily this knight is guarding the bishop, or else we would lose it. So we get out of check by king to H8, of course. And now, even though white has played a check, suddenly the C pawn is massively underdefended. So when it was defended, it was just simply captured. Okay, so obviously white cannot take back because of the queen C3 check and winning the rook. So rook to D1 helps defend. Bishop takes bishop check, rook takes, and then black captures on F4. And now we not only have a safe king, reasonable development, we're now up a pawn on top of that with no pawn weaknesses. We don't have any corresponding weaknesses. White still has splitties over here. In fact, he's got 3 splitties and is massively underdeveloped. So already I would say that black is practically winning here. G3 was played, which allows black to start playing for the attack themselves. Bishop to H3, a very unusual place for the bishop, but perhaps he thought that this exchange would be preferable. So let's see how he feels about it. And he feels like trading, because of course after rook to D3, he gets a few tempi on the queen. However, queen C1 check, forces back rook to D1, queen C3 check, and then rook to D2. So of course here, if I want to keep checking, then we have at least a draw. However, we just simply centralize our final rook, and now we have a model of coordination. The queenside pawns are healthy, straight, and well defended. The rooks are excellently placed. The queen is harassing, and the knight has a bunch of places to go to. So, and we're up a pawn, and our king is safe, and. So this is excellent now. White finally got castles in, and after knight to e5, now black goes into trade mode. Since we're up a pawn, let's try to trade off a few pieces. White captured, black checked, and in this position, I believe white resigned. No, white played king to g2, and then resigned here. Now, it might be a little too early to resign, but of course, in this kind of position, all black really has to do is trade off and go into an end game. Now, I think most people would play this one out, but evidently this was not to white's liking here, and actually play king g2 and actually resign. So another success. Okay, so let's go to line 3. d4, knight f6, c4, e5, take, knight e4. And then we have the final queen move, which is queen to c2. Queen c2 is also met by bishop to b4. And in this particular game, white defended it with the knight. Now, of course, if the check is defended by a bishop, then we always temporarily win the bishop pair by capturing on d2. When they guard with the knight, however, again, white is putting unpleasant pressure on the knight. So the first time we dealt with this, we played f5. The second time we dealt with this, we exchanged off the knight. This particular variation, we actually guard it with the d pawn. Now, the purpose of this is to try to take advantage of white's queen c2 move by eventually playing bishop to f5. This will set up some discovery possibilities onto the queen. Now, in this particular game, we'll also get to see a very greedy strategy by white, where white actually takes en passant, which again threatens this. So we play our bishop to f5 move, which in some cases threatens knight to g3, which is not only going to protect the bishop that's doing the discovery on the queen, but it's also going to hit the rook in the corner. So sometimes this is the big threat in the position. As it was, white actually kept chopping away. So this, of course, threatens the queen, so we must capture. And white gave a check. Now, this is probably not the best move, even though it looks like it forks the king and the bishop. In this position, knight to c6 simply develops and guards the bishop quite easily. And now black is starting to get an overwhelming lead in development, which actually grows within a couple more moves. Knight f3, castles long, and after g3, black now starts to play for the attack with queen to b6. So now the threat is queen f2 mate. And again, in this position, black has actually got a 2-pawn deficit, but has developed both bishops, both knights, has castled. The rook on d8 is excellent, and the queen is well placed. White is only, it's got 2 pawns up, but has only developed 3 pieces, but one of the pieces is pinned. So this should be fairly good compensation for the 2 pawns. Also, the final rook, again, will have a nice place to go to, and we could be attacking right up the center. As it was, white had to play e3 to guard the checkmate. And here, with one solution amongst many, black decided to exchange a few pieces, like so. And then I played rook takes d2 like this. So this is basically leading to, I don't know, like Morphy versus the Count type of play, where we sacrifice all of white's pieces that have been developed and leave them with mostly undeveloped pieces and a king to attack with. So the point to this sacrifice is that, of course, if white takes the rook, then black will take on b2 with check and pick up the rook on the very next move. So that's not good. So actually, in this position, white is already losing. The finish was, somewhat okay. So what white finally developed, rook takes f2 was played. So now we're threatening queen takes e3 with a really quick mate. So this one was actually accepted. Queen takes b2, king f3. Now, I'm not saying that how this game was finished was absolutely good or absolutely the best. It was just a way to win. I mean, there might be more than one move in this position. This was the one that was chosen because when the bishop is captured, then the other bishop could be captured with check. And here, Of course, black is down in exchange, but white's king is floating around in space, which is not very pleasant. King to f4, and then we went after him with g5. So black can choose to capture and allow the rook into the game with check. In this position, he chose not to capture, which allows another pawn to get into the fray. Then the pawn was captured, and after queen to e4, resigns happens because rook to g8 is extremely hard to stop. And it will lead to an extremely quick mate no matter what white does. So this will conclude all the different queen moves. Okay, so take knight to e4, and let's take a look at knight to d2. So one of the somewhat of the professional moves. All right, in this particular one, when the knights are attacking each other like this time we don't pin it with the bishop, although that is a line, and that line has some fans and some adherents. So it's not completely terrible. Knight c5 is more along the lines of not going in for some quick exchanges. We're actually just going to keep the pieces on and try to play for complications. So knight c5, and of course, if b4 ever happens, so we can always drop the knight back to e6, which is a good square. So that's actually what we get to see in this game, the knight going back to the square, and this, of course, wins a tempo on the B pawn, so it must be defended. And here's where we play the move a5, putting lots of pressure on b4. And of course, the only good move for white is to push by, and this gives us the use of the c5 square for some time. It does make our b knight a little bit uncomfortable, but we can always get this guy out onto d7, as we shall see. So here we played f6 again. There are several different moves here that could be played. b6 is one of them, just simply putting the bishop on the long diagonal as quick as possible. d6, I think, is certainly playable as well, gambiting a pawn but opening up the center. We just chose f6. Okay, so this particular opponent was rated 2060, and so expecting e takes f6, and then of course we would take back with the queen, which gives us certain types of compensation in the form of open ENF files and quick development. This particular player chose to give the pawn back right away with e3, which is always an option. As a matter of fact, I don't even think that I think the computers even think that this is an okay situation where white can give the pawn back. Now here, perhaps the idea is that after black takes on e5, white was intending to play queen h5 check with the idea of g6, queen takes e5. Unfortunately, this runs right into bishop g7, which picks up an entire rook for black. So suddenly this strategy isn't looking quite so good, and black actually gets their pawn back right away, which is quite nice. g6, now actually bishop d3 was threatening queen h5, so g6 was played, and in some of these Budapest we can put the bishop on g7 as well. So d6 defends the pawn, knight d7 also defends the pawn, and now this knight that was on b8, once it goes to d7, can easily go to c5, which is a much better piece than the one on b8. Bishop g7, and now we actually have something that looks more like a King's Indian, especially if black castle's behind this. We've got a fairly good King's Indian, I would say, if we can achieve that. Bishop c2, knight c5 first, h4. Now, h4 might actually carry some weight if that rook had stayed behind it on h1, but nevertheless, the pawn coming to h5 is a bit irritating. So this is, this is something that we can't quite ignore. But we do allow white to do what they want up to a point. So h5, and now here we realize that if white ever captures this pawn, then all we have to do is simply move the h pawn, and this will sacrifice the pawn. But what it will do is it will block any pieces from coming to g6. So, for example, if bishop to b7 is what is played, if white here actually captures this guy, then we're certainly not taking back and allowing bishop to takes g6. What we can do is just simply move the h pawn. We can move it to h6 or h5. whichever one looks better. And so this is a pawn sacrifice, but designed to actually try to slow up white's attack. And in the meantime, black can actually set up their queen and castle queen side. And then we could try to collect the G pawn later, or we could just use our pieces and go for the attack. This was the intention. This is not what happened, though. White built up. So now white might actually be threatening bishop takes G6 with some irritating attacks. So queen to F6 actually helps defend. And again, if white captures, we're not taking back. We're just going to bypass and you know, and just leave the G pawn there. White attacks the queen, so we have to exchange. And this also hits the bishop, so we defended this with castles. And here, with all these pawns locked up like this will not lead to any sort of line opening attack against the king, whereas black has got all kinds of play against the white king here. So bishop c6, fairly good move. So this way, if captures happens, then the pawn will get closer and potentially try to trap the black king. Here, greed was, well, no, not employed yet. Knight c5, threatening maybe knight b3. So queen d1 defended against that. And then captures happened, since nothing is going to happen to the black king here. And then we used greed. We actually took this pawn. Now we have all these beat up pawns on the king side, but now we also have some some pawns to use, and we also have some files to use. All right, so rook to b1, bishop to h6. So this is intending to put the rook on a half open file. Queen h2 hits the pawn, so we defend it. Queen f3 brings the queen to kind of a dangerous area. Rook to g8, so now the queen is rooted to g2. Queen h3 check. Let's get now this is probably a small little quibble here. Probably this is not the best move. We should probably just like move the king and get on with the attack here. This one allowed a queen trade, but instead white decided to get their pawn back. But this allowed a couple of unpleasant tempi. Rook to g5, queen to f3, and rook to f8. So suddenly we got both rooks in play with a gain of time. Queen to d5, offering another trine quaid. However, this one was rejected. Queen to g6. So now we're playing all out for mate. White is defending himself at the moment. However, in this position, g4 was played. A most risky defense to this particular attack. Now the king is very much wide open, and hard to say. Now here, black, of course, played e4. Now this does a sneak attack on the queen, but also it is, putting some pressure on the f3 square, which is going to be important after the next move. After queen to d1, here we found rook to f3. Now the idea with this particular move is that the rook is actually blocking the queen from defending g4, and if white actually captures this guy, then simply rook takes g4 check, king to h1 is the only move, and instead of playing queen h5 check, allowing knight h2, we just simply collect the knight, and now queen h5 is unstoppable. So the rook is totally poisonous on f3. So he does not take. He plays king h1. And to finish this one off, we actually played another rook sacrifice here. Now you could take either rook if you want, but it turns out both rooks again are poisonous. If knight takes this rook, then we take back with the queen, and rook h3 is unstoppable. If knight takes the f3 rook, then again, we just simply capture it, and queen h5 is unstoppable. The king is too weak. So both rooks have to be rejected. Here, he played rook to g1, trying hard to trade off. Knight to d3 was played, which is another nice move to play. This is threatening knight takes f2 checkmate, and also winning the queen. Queen to e2 does not actually help, because after knight takes f2, here white resigned. If white has to capture. When they capture, rook takes, and if knight takes rook, then queen h5 is a very, very quick checkmate. If rook takes knight, then this is a remove the guard tactic, and then we pick up the rook, and this is just completely winning. So this is a fairly nice game against the knight to d2 variation. So let's move on to variation number 4, knight to e4, and we shall look at a3. Now, this is probably one of the more popular moves because it just physically takes away bishop to b4 resource, and white still is intending to hold on to the pawn with on e5 in many variations. And here's where d6 is extremely popular and leads to some really tricky chess that there's a few tactical situations where black is winning games, within 10 moves. Here we play b6 as well. So the idea, of course, once again, is to play bishop to b5. Here, knight f3. Now, this actually transposes to knight f3, b6, a3. So we can actually get this position from 2 different move orders. We should play bishop to b7 because white was threatening queen to d5 there. Knight to d2. And again, when the knights are looking at each other, here we actually have a couple of options. We can actually ignore this particular development because we are defended. So this means that if black wants to make some sort of developing move like bishop to e7 or some sort of gambit move with d6 and f6, that the knight, there is no pressure on the knight. However, we can still play knight to c5. So this is a way to avoid trading and keep the position juicy and keep all the excitement in the position. All right. So queen c2. Now, in these kind of positions, when the knight is on c5 and white does not kick it with b4, then a5 is an extremely useful move for black, preventing b4 forever. And in some cases, you might actually trundle on to a4 and have a nice grip on the b3 square for some time. So this is a very useful move. b3 is played. So this is usual. If they can't play b4, they'll play b3. Bishop to e7. So this bishop also could be developed by g6 and bishop g7. That was also possible. But bishop to e7 was played here. Also just developing normally. e4, probably not the best move. There's a few squares that are going to get weakened because of this. Castle, bishop to e2, knight c6, developing the knight, bishop to b2, d6. Okay, so again, this is one of these types of positions where we have mostly completed development. We just need to develop the a8 rook and the queen. We have fairly good development. We have very healthy pawns. We are down a pawn, but we have a lot of attacking possibilities in this particular position. All right, so white accepts the gambit, and here black takes back with the queen. So this develops the queen, and again, we make some room for some quick development. White played e5, and here black played queen to h6. So getting the queen into a good attacking position where there is no counterattack on the queen. The queen has a nice post here that she can stay at for a while, especially when white castled. So now we have something to look at here, at the very least. So rook d8 finally completes development. And again, I mean, is there a gambit where, is there any gambit where black gets like completed development, and still has a good position in spite of being minus a pawn? I mean, there's probably a few, but I don't think this one's so bad. I mean, this bishop looks really nice. The knights look great. The dark square bishop looks fairly flexible. The queen looks well posted and hard to get rid of. Not bad for just a pawn. Bishop c3, knight e6 retreating. So this is possibly setting up knight f4, maybe knight g5, maybe knight d4, maybe this knight to d4. We get some options here. Knight to e4, and let's see, I played knight c6 to d4. So unleashing the bishop, attacking the light square bishop, attacking the queen. So white exchanges twice, like so, and protects the knight. Now, in this position, black now has the bishop pair. White is still up a pawn, but of course, black has activity. The rook is good. Both bishops are good. The queen is good. This rook can easily double on the d file. We don't have bad compensation for this pawn. Queen f4, immediately trying to get the pawn back. This is still undefended. Also, this triple attacks e4. So excellent. So knight f6 check. A fairly good move, but not followed up correctly here. So the idea, of course, is that white now has a discovery on the bishop. So bishop takes is correct. And then the correct move here is to capture this bishop, and then black should collect the e5 pawn and have a small advantage in the late middle game here. We do have opposite color bishops, which should make it very difficult to win this one. But black has got good control of the center, and even a move like this. I mean, of course, we're threatening mate. We have maybe disco powers on the a1 rook, and our pieces are better placed here, but maybe not enough to win. But still, it's still a good advertisement for the gambit. I mean, black's position is not bad there. Instead, white chose to actually take the f6 bishop, and I think the miscalculation is that white was intending to take on g7 on the next move, because black, of course, can exchange bishops. And I think the idea is to win a tempo on the rook by taking on g7. But I think at the last moment, it was noticed that queen g4 is actually forcing checkmate, whether white takes the rook or not. So even if you take the rook and make a queen, and black takes the newborn queen, since this is checkmate, the only move is g3, and black will just simply play queen h3 with vega mate here, and this is unstoppable. So the in-between move that was played for can't be played for, and he doesn't want to be down a piece, so he must take the bishop. But then after queen takes f3, rook to g4 is devastating. So rook d1 was played. Probably rook e1 was a little bit better, because after rook to g4 check, king to f1, all we have to do is threaten queen h1 checkmate, and we do this by simply playing rook to e8, preventing the king from escaping. And now queen here or queen here is checkmate, and it's impossible to stop that. So white resigned. This particular opponent was rated 1900, so not bad. All right, d4, knight f6, c4, e5, takes, knight e4, and knight f3. So this is also one of the main lines, a perfectly good developing move. Here we also play b6, and we showed all the different traps with queen to d5. This particular opponent played e3. Now this opponent was the lowest rated of all the opponents we have here, rated only 1500. Nevertheless, the position that the 1500 gets is probably the best out of all of these. And in this position, white chose to play rather simply. Bishop to e2, or bishop e7, bishop to e2. And because the pawn was on e3, and so that means the bishop isn't influencing g5. In this game, I decided to try out the g5 strategy. I mentioned this briefly in the video. This is a lot more of a risky strategy, but it also is aggressive. So it has to be dealt with fairly accurately. And because it looks like that black is threatening some sort of pawn storm, it would seem that castles is a little bit crazy, because it's just walking into what black wants to do. Nevertheless, this position was held quite nicely. g4 was played, knight to d4, which hits the g pawn twice, so h5, and then white just simply played f3. And white is extremely well developed here, and any opening of the f file should give white some really excellent play. This position is already a bit creaky here for black. So in an effort to try something new, knight g5 was played. Now, again, we can go to e6. So this is something of a little bit of a bluff. I mean, we're not really going to go to h3. We're not really going to sacrifice on f3. We're still going to go to our favorite square, e6. We're just going to do it in a different way to see if we can't complicate the game. So e4 was played, which does hit the knight from the bishop, just in case that is needed. So bishop c5 pins the knight to the king. Bishop to e3 breaks the pin. Knight e6 sort of makes the pin worse. Knight to f5, very good move, not only defending the bishop, but possibly possibly putting pressure on g7 in some cases. Queen g5, so this is a tactical move. Obviously, this can't be captured because it's pinned, but we're trying to make the game complicated here. But this, in my opinion, this position is clearly favorable for white. So bishop takes bishop, and pawn takes bishop. So another kind of weird looking move, especially since it opens up the B file and doubles the pawns and isolates another. But again, we're trying to make this game complicated. We are down a pawn, but we do have some force of buildup on the king side. So white has to play somewhat accurately here in order to defend against this. And this happens for a little while. So queen b3 hits the bishop. So the bishop defended itself. Knight c3, good developing move, just threatening to put the knight on somewhere good. d5 or b5. Knight f4. So again, trying to play for, maybe like a gf or a knight takes e2 or something like that. Rook to f2, defending both things. Knight takes anyway. Knight takes. And knight a6. So the idea here is actually to castle. Even though this castle position looks really drafty and really, really weak, and everything over here is going to be weak, this knight had to be developed somehow. So this is probably one of the only cases where the knight goes to a6. Queen c3, another strong move, in some cases threatening e6. So g takes f, queen takes. Now this is threatening, well, what, maybe knight d6 and queen takes f7. Something like that. I mean, white has a lot of options here, and we had to castle behind this slop. So this is not really great king protection, but sometimes you have to do these types of things in order to get winning chances. Knight c3 again. So again, eyeballing two good squares. Rook to e8, at least eyeballing a weak pawn. Knight to d5, and we win a pawn. Hooray! So we actually get our pawn back after all of this, and we've almost completed development. Now, of course, white has got almost like a model of coordination here, and now trying to use it. So this queen, again, is skewering all of this. It's also hitting here. We try to defend ourselves with bishop to c6, queen c3, hitting the rook. Here, completing development and defending the rook, and also now putting pressure on the e-pawn, which is suddenly weak. Here, a queen trade was offered, and we accept it. Take, and h4. So this takes away removes the defender of e4. Knight f1, and takes. And now, after all of that, we finally are up a pawn here. Although white still has, rook takes f7, and still has some good moves here. However, knight f6, this looks like it was a fork. But rook to e1 gets out of this particular tactic. So the rook on a1 is hanging. So, of course, he exchanges. Take, rook to d2, which double attacks the d pawns. So this was just simply defended. King f2 hits the rook. Rook to e5. Defending against knight h5, I guess, but that allows knight g4 anyway, or knight to d5. Capture. A rook trade was offered, which was probably a big mistake, because after rook takes, pawn takes, and knight to b4, the knight finally gets exhumed. Black ends up in an endgame with an extra pawn, and in fact, they're going to be up 2 pawns depending on which pawn is defended. And here, white resigned. But nevertheless, I think this particular game showed that that even simple play could give simple play from knight f3, by the way, b6, e3, bishop to b7 here. Perhaps the g pawn adds too much excitement to the game. So it may be that, this g5 move should be timed in certain positions correctly or against certain opponents correctly. I am certain that bishop to b4 and just getting on with development must be an okay move. Again, you can play a d6 or f6 type gambit. Perhaps you could even play g6 instead of g5. This game proved to me that the g5 stuff is risky and it might be fun. Maybe that type of thing is more suited for blitz chess rather than correspondence chess. This particular opponent, had the advantage for a very, very long time. All right, so this has been the Fajarowicz Budapest in action here. I will end the video with that. As usual, my name is Coach Matt for the Seattle Chess School, and we shall see you guys on the next one.